Welcome to the Croc Podcast.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Here is your host, Dr. E.
Howdy, Croc Nation. Dr. Tommy Anelli here with another Croc Podcast, joined by my best bud, Mr. Angel Santana from Have Faith, Let It Begin. Angel, I have a contest going on tonight between best buds. I say you're my best bud, but our guest tonight is also my best bud. So at the end of this podcast, I'll let you guys know who my actual real best bud is.
Listen, no competition. On the heels of our beloved New York Mets not doing well, I'm a little bit hurt, but you know what? We went out and got somebody to cheer us up, somebody that's going to enlighten the humor and the the entire room. And I'm excited to have this guest.
You already got 1 point because you're a Mets fan, whereas our guest is a Yankee fan, so he'll have to play catch up right before he even introduced. But to talk about tonight's podcast, I want to give you a little background first. So I've been wanting to do sort of a site-specific homage or hats off or salute to different tumor sites. And I've been wanting to do this for a long time, and I just haven't gotten around to it. So by a series of coincidences, we're going to talk tonight about a specific site. But Angel, I guess my question to you is that we know cancer just in general is extraordinarily scary and fearful. And one of the reasons we do this podcast is to try to demystify cancer and try to have our survivor thrivers actually be uplifted to know and feel confident that they're going to do well. But if you were to pick a site, whether it be breast or whether it be prostate or lung or colorectal, what site would you say as a layman, if you were going to, be told by a doctor that you have a type of cancer, what would scare the living bejesus out of you the most?
I would probably say in being a part of your show now and knowing all the different types of cancer that we've covered, for me, it would be colon cancer.
It would. That's the wrong answer now, but it would be, in my opinion, it would be brain cancer. Because if you think about it, the ability just to think and to articulate and to walk and to use your appendages and just to kind of be able to live and experience life, you need your brain and you need your senses. So I would say that universally, the number one the scariest of all cancers would be brain cancer. And that comes to the coincidences. So we'll start this series with brain cancer, both primary brain cancers and metastatic brain cancers. And it was, the coincidences were twofold. I was watching a Monty Python episode where there was the skit, with Michael Palin and John Cleese, with the man coming into the room and saying, "Doctor, my brain hurts," and then going in and having these neurosurgeons, basically go in with hatchets and saws and all sorts of things. And the second coincidence was thanks to my dear friend from college, Jim Melisi. Dr. Jim Melisi happened to contact me and push for us to get together and sort of, trying to get back and find out where we have been to, over the last 20 years while our careers have gone in separate but similar ways. And he came out for the weekend and I got a chance to do just that with his beautiful wife, Deborah, and Denise. And we had a delightful fall weekend in the Hudson Valley. And then I thought to myself, well, what better way to talk about and demystify the scariness and the fearfulness of brain cancer than to have my bestie, Jim Melisi, Dr. Jim Melisi, discuss it from his aspect, from a very, as a prominent and well-respected and regarded neurosurgeon. So this is the part, Jim, where I embarrass you, and I apologize in advance. I hope you'll still talk to me after this part. But who else, you knew that this kid was going to be a success when his first career choice was being an astronaut, and his fallback position was to be a neurosurgeon. So this guy had really no chance not to be successful. Whereas I wanted to be either a doctor or a fireman or something like that. Jim wanted to be an astronaut, but thankfully, because of the gift of him as a healer, God directed him into the field of neurosurgery. But the thing that sets Jim apart is you really get to know somebody pretty well when you're spending 24 hours in a room studying. You get to, you eat cold pizza and you have to endure each other's smells after 24 hours of studying. And the other thing is, the quality and the content of a person by the fact that we both didn't go to Ivy League schools as undergrads. We went to a very, average college, and trying to get into medical school, into an American medical school was a very, very difficult thing back in the early 1980s. So actually, in retrospect, looking at it, we were actually competitors, but dear friends. So that person was a sincere, good person if you were his competitor and they respected you enough to be able to work together to both try to achieve that similar goal. And he did exactly that. So all Jim needed was to get that acceptance letter. So he got that acceptance letter to Downstate, SUNY Downstate, and mine to Rutgers. We both kind of went our separate ways for those 4 years, reconnected in our fourth year to do a rotation together. And then Jim did the second most incredible thing in his career, and that was to get his first choice residency in neurosurgery at a very prestigious program in Washington, D.C. at George W. And, became chief resident. His accolades and his awards are numerous. His presentations and his publications are too many to go through on this podcast, but suffice it to say that in every aspect of his education, whether it be his college education, his graduate school education, his internship, his residency, Jim has always distinguished himself as to be the best. In his long and storied career as a neurosurgeon, likewise, he did the same thing, going into different aspects of neurosurgery, private practice, group practice, in a medical group in New Mexico, back to Northern Virginia, and et cetera, et cetera. He also earned a master's in business administration at Johns Hopkins in order to also assist, in this medical management disaster, that's happening now. Jim is also a leader on that side of the ball as well. So Jim's interests outside of medicine are equally as impressive. He is absolutely and beyond doubt, number one, a family man. His family is his soul. His family is his reason to wake up in the morning. His beautiful wife, his 2 children, his grandchildren. He also has a wanderlust. I thought I did, but Jim trumps me by a million. He has traveled the world. He's a world-class photographer and artist. And everything that Jim does, he does to perfection. So embarrassment aside, I'd like to, on behalf of Angel and the board of directors, welcome Dr. James Melisi onto the podcast.
Well, thank you, Tom, for that introduction. That usually goes along with someone's eulogy. So I'm hoping that that's not the case. Couple of comments. It's a pleasure to actually get together again with you. It's been too long, as we said. One of the things I've learned from neurosurgery and taking care of patients is that you really only get one chance to go around on this merry-go-round. And as one of my patients told me a long time ago, it's not the things that you acquire in life, but the difference that you make in people's lives. And hopefully that is something that both of us are doing. If I can digress just a second, in listening to your, I'll call it your opening monologue, you mentioned the Monty Python routine. I'm familiar with that routine, but in terms of brain surgery, one of my favorite movie scenes is Woody Allen. Woody Allen was one of my favorite comedians, and in Hannah and Her Sisters, in the opening portion of the movie, if I remember right, you remember Woody Allen's the consummate hypochondriac, and he starts garnering symptoms, and he gets convinced that by the time he's done thinking about all the symptoms that he has a brain tumor. And in fact, they show him in a doctor's office waiting in a very scared manner, and he goes in for a CAT scan, and of course he finally wakes up from his bad dream. And then the other thing maybe I should just mention is you're right, when we were in college, and I never really thought of us as being competitors. It's interesting that you said that. I certainly realized that we were competitors, not you and I, but others when I was in medical school. But of course, there's the old joke about how many pre-med students does it take to screw in a light bulb? And of course, the answer is two, one to do it and one to kick the chair out from under him. So with that, I think maybe we should go ahead and start. And
Yeah, no, wonderful. Thank you very much. And thanks for being on tonight. Angel, any introductory comments?
No, I just know that everybody better strap on your seatbelts. It's going to be a good ride right now.
Yeah, no doubt. So, one of the things that fascinated me about brain cancer, even as a resident, so back in the 1980s, both of us, Jim and I, had met very, very nice, wonderful people who woke up one day either with a seizure or with a headache and went to the doctors. And as things started to kind of play out, they were told that they had what was called the glioblastoma multiforme, which is probably the worst cancer that you can get. And back in those days, when we would present these cases, they were all identical. Young 40-year-old, whatever, young professional, young kids, same story. Had a seizure while they were driving or had a headache and blah, blah, blah. And what we would do is we would, do surgery to our best ability. We'll do radiation to our best ability and do hydroxyurea or some really old-fashioned chemotherapy, alkylating agent. And, within 6 months, 95% of these patients would be dead. And the thought process was that if a person who was diagnosed with a glioblastoma, if they lived a year, they did not have a glioblastoma. And that always was in my brain as far as, oh my God, what a terrible, terrible, terrible thing this is. And this is what gives cancer such a bad name. And I think that people that have brain cancers are stuck on that and that they feel that this is back in the 1980s. And then as things started to progress with some of the things that we're going to be discussing today, some advances and new frontiers in the management of brain cancer, things started to change. And both Jim and I both know patients and have patients in our practices that are long-term survivors of even glioblastoma. So tonight's episode is about what most Croc episodes are supposed to be about. And that's not about hopelessness and it's not about fear, but it's about hope and new frontiers in trying to get you through your survivorship and make your survivorship that much better. So I'm going to begin the podcast tonight by asking Jim to comment about basically brain cancer and brain metastasis, primary brain cancer and brain metastasis, the different types of brain cancers with an emphasis on glioblastoma, the differences between primary brain cancers and metastatic disease.
All right, well, thank you, Tom. Obviously, that's a wide subject. So to put it simply for the general public out there, basically, brain tumors are tumors that arise obviously within the head. We try to differentiate them by what we call primary tumors and secondary tumors. So the primary tumors are the tumors that actually arise within the brain tissue themselves or the coverings of the brain tissues. Some of them are benign, some of them are malignant. The ones that develop within the brain tissue itself will include, as you said, the glioblastoma or other glial type tumors. I should say that the reason we come up with these words, and I'll try not to use the jargon so that the general public can understand a little better. There are really two kinds of cells within the brain itself. There are supporting cells, and then there are the neurons. Now, most tumors that arise in the brain don't come from the nerve cells or the neurons. They come from the glial cells or the supporting cells, and that's what we're going to concentrate on mostly, I guess, tonight. There is no such thing, as it has turned out, as a glioblast cell, but that was the name of the cell that was given to this type of tumor. That's a primary tumor many years ago, and it's become very difficult to get it out of the lexicon or the vernacular or the jargon of the neurologist and neurosurgeon. So we'll stick with that. A glioblastoma is a primary tumor of the brain. It represents one of the most common tumors, primary tumors that occur in the brain. The other being the tumors that arise from the coverings of the brain, which are meningiomas, for example, that are more benign tumors. The other type of tumors are tumors that come from someplace else. Patients that have cancer, they call it systemic cancer. For example, breast cancer, colon cancer, lung cancer, melanoma, skin cancer, renal cell cancer. It can come from any place else. And those cells, during the course of the development of the tumor, get loose, they end up in the bloodstream, and they circulate throughout the body, and they land in the brain. And when they land in the brain, they become a secondary tumor, and they grow, and that's what we call a metastatic tumor.
So, Jim, tonight we're going to take both of those two subjects, and we're going to briefly talk about these new frontiers and talk about some of the things that should give hope to patients, even patients who have stage 4 metastatic cancer and patients who have the notorious GBM. So since you and I both kind of came up the same time, we both saw the failures in our approach to primary brain cancers, and that's what we'll start with. Surgical techniques were not as sophisticated. The ability to maximally debulk, which is a fancy word, which we're going to change to be able to cut it all out. We want to get that cancer out. So the radiation is more effective, or the treatments with the chemotherapy are more effective. The ability for the neurosurgeon to do that have improved tremendously. So I'd ask you to comment on that comment.
Yeah, thank you. The surgical techniques are not a whole lot different. The instrumentation that we use is a little better today. We'll start with just the glioblastoma, or the primary brain tumor, the tumor that comes from the brain cells itself. Those tumors generally occur in the bigger parts of the brain, the frontal areas, the temporal lobe areas, what we call the parietal lobes of the area, somewhat if you're thinking of the head over your ear somewhere. So anyway, there isn't any place in the brain that a neurosurgeon really can't go. The art of the surgery is really deciding when to approach a certain area of the brain and if we can do it safely. So we can do it much more safely now, and the surgical treatment of, say, glioblastoma, primary brain tumors, still remains first and foremost one of the most important parts of the treatment plan. Now, obviously, radiation and/or chemotherapy afterwards, it becomes just as important, but surgery, debulking, removing as much of the tumor burden as you can is really the primary goal and the first approach to treating those primary tumors. We're a lot better at it now than we were years ago. The prognosis we can talk about how we've, if we've advanced much at all for primary brain tumors, certainly for secondary brain tumors, for metastatic tumors, we've advanced much more in that field. And that has to do with the fact that the medical oncologists are able to manage the systemic disease, the disease itself, so that we as neurosurgeons don't want the patient to be dying of their brain disease. So if we can maximize treatment of the brain disease, then that's really our goal.
Yeah, and you made a really good point. So, Angel, when we were talking about, Jim and I seeing patients now living years and years with glioblastoma, I believe Jim is absolutely correct. I think that it starts with the knife. The least amount of viable tumor cells, or any tumor cells that are left in that cavity, those are the patients that I see that have a chance to be survivors. And I think that, again, I said to Jim when I saw him face to face, the greatest gift I think God could ever give a surgeon is judgment. Because everyone can learn to use a knife, everyone can learn to stitch and to sew and things like that. But without good surgical judgment, you're not going to be a great surgeon. And I think that being able to push that frontier and being able to kind of push and push and push, but not push too far, because if you make one bad judgment, you might cut out all the tumor, but the patient may be the worse for wear with neurological symptoms and things like that. Would you agree with that, Jim?
Yeah, without question. The good news, though, is that we're able now to go into more eloquent areas of the brain that years ago we might have been afraid to because of what is available in the operating room to us. We have navigation systems. I call it GPS in the operating room. We're able to navigate throughout the brain using the imaging studies, the MRIs, the CAT scans, the angiograms that the patients had prior to surgery, and then take a little wand-like device, or a pointer, I call it, and we can just point to areas within the brain as we're dissecting or as we're taking the tumor out, and the images of the MRI come up on a screen in front of us so that we know exactly where we are without having to go either too deep or too far, or know if we have to keep going or if there's still more tumor. So just like driving on a highway and not knowing exactly where you are, but relying on your map and your satellite, we have all of that in the operating room now. We have devices that we can surgically remove the tumors that cause less injury to the surrounding brain. And that's, as you say, the important thing in not causing any harm as you're resecting tumor, because you are taking tumor tissue with brain tissue out when you're taking primary tumors out. And we can do that with impunity now in many cases, with less fear of causing injury. With secondary tumors, with metastatic tumors from the brain, from elsewhere that spread to the brain, we can do that even, I hesitate to use the word simply, but we certainly can use it, do it a little better, because they usually have good margins that separate between normal tissue and abnormal tissue. And I tell patients that if you're a product of the 1970s, for example, if you remember the dessert that the people used to have in their houses, where they'd have Jello and they'd have a piece of fruit in the Jello. And I usually tell them that taking a metastatic tumor out is like taking the fruit out without taking the Jello out. And that's the goal of the surgery, which we can accomplish fairly easily.
Yeah, and we certainly appreciate that, because that's a good segue into my role. And what my role would be to eradicate any residual cells that are still alive, together with the chemotherapy, which we'll discuss in a second. But radiation oncology has likewise come a long way from the 1980s and prior. When I first came up, we would use what's called whole brain techniques, where we would radiate everyone's brain. And again, I think the doctor's perspective in those days, even those were in the days of, big time mastectomies, even for early breast cancer, and, where more was better. And now we know that less is more. And certainly with radiation therapy, we have the primary goal of course, eradicating the tumor, but with a close second, making sure a patient's quality of life, especially the neurocognitive, which is another fancy word, which just means we do not want people falling asleep in their oatmeal after they have surgery and radiation, right? We want them to be able to be viable, vibrant people with good thought processes and good memories and things like that. So we no longer do whole brain radiation, and especially in primary brain cancers, because the paradox about, these types of primary brain cancers is they don't act like other cancers. Other cancers are nefarious and spread throughout the body, through the bloodstream, and things through the lymphatics, and they kill you that way. Whereas these primary brain tumors, you sort of know exactly where the enemy is, and you can bomb it, and you can, throw, basically a hydrogen bomb at it. And sometimes these glioblastomas in the old days used to just laugh at the treatments. So we kind of know where we have to focus our intent and focus our BMAP. So as far as the radiation stuff, absolutely. We also have better treatment planning capabilities. We're able to be more focused with our rays. And we also have a new modality over the last maybe 15, 20 years, which is not an X-ray beam at all, but a particle beam, either of protons or other such things, and protons being the most accessible. And I know in Virginia, Jim has access to a couple of proton centers in that area. And we have one in New York City that we have partnered with. So being able to give even more focused radiation with these high energy particles as opposed to X-rays has been a great advance in the radiation oncology side. On the medical oncology side, I would actually say medical oncology slash pathology, because I think the biggest change really that's making the hugest difference, besides better surgery and better radiation, is actually better identification of these brain tumors. So in the old days, Jim would take the tumor out, and there would be a pathologist would look at it under a microscope and say, this is X, this is Y, this is Z. We can't do that anymore, because not only do they take it out, look at it under the microscope, but now they actually really genomically slash genetically slash molecularly, dissect these tumors. And they've come up with different sorts of prognosticators that help patients know where they are on the map. So, I can tell you the simple stuff, like there's the IDH1s and the MGMTs, which mean nothing to you guys. But for us, these are different words that perhaps make these patients more vulnerable to the systemic therapy, aka the chemotherapy, these alkylating agents. So if you have an enzyme that repairs DNA, we don't want that, because Jim and I want to kill these cancer cells, and we want to sort of injure them, and then we want them to die. If we injure them and we don't allow them to die because they're able to enzymatically repair this DNA damage, that's no good. So we know that information. There is also a tremendous amount of things that I couldn't even tell you that go into evaluating these brain tumors, as far as the different mutations. And it's like a Batman, show where when they start fighting and they have these pows and these bams and these whams and things that come out, they have all these different sort of molecular names and codes and things that I think are just going to get more and more sophisticated over time. So Jim, that would be my view as far as frontiers on primary brain cancers. Do you have anything to add before we get into metastasis?
Well, yeah, just briefly, Tom, you hit on really the big points. Prognostic factors, for example, the prognosis. When we talk about, quite frankly, patients want to know, how long am I going to live? And sometimes they're going to ask that in a roundabout way. Occasionally, they'll come right out and ask, but that's the answer, or that's the question that they're seeking an answer to. And the prognostic factors used to be like the extent, for example, of the disease, the age of the person, and what we used to call their performance status. I tell patients in a more layman's term, the better you are going into an operation or a treatment plan, the better you are coming out. So if you're awake, alert, and you're in good shape, and you're able to think and walk, then the likelihood of you getting through the surgical procedures and the subsequent therapies later is high. But nowadays, you're right. Since we went to school, there's been much more information gained on the molecular genetics of these cancers, far more than, quite frankly, this neurosurgeon can understand at this point in my career. And I've always said it's not going to happen in my career, but the treatment of at least the primary brain cancers like glioblastomas, I honestly believe that although today surgery is the primary treatment plan followed by radiation and chemotherapy, I think the answer to that treatment is eventually going to be in the laboratory someplace. Immunotherapy, some sort of nanotherapy where you can give a certain medication or immunotherapeutic agent, put it in the bloodstream and have it attack the tumors. The problem with glioblastomas today, and always really has been, and I liken it again when I'm talking to patients, is think of a house. And a house has windows, and the windows have shutters. And the reason why we haven't gotten very good about treating these tumors with adjuvant therapy, radiation, and/or chemotherapy later on is because the medications we have don't pinpoint exactly the cell type. In other words, one person's glioblastoma may be a little different from somebody else's. So the shutters are a little different. It may look like the house next door, but the shutters are a little different. So the agents that they gave over the course of years didn't always attack the tumor in some patients as well as others, because the tumors are just a little bit different. Yeah, we have graded prognostic assessments now. It's based really more on the cancer type that the patients have as well as the molecular genetics, and not so much the age or the performance status.
Thank you very much for that. And it's a good segue now. As scary as we've just been in scary land with GBMs and primary brain tumors, I think our survivor thrivers are equally as put out and brought to their knees by that conversation with their doctor when they are told that their kidney cancer or their lung cancer or their breast cancer has spread now to the brain, and they have what's called stage 4 metastatic brain cancer. And I believe, as I've been trying to, point out on this podcast, with the motif of hope rather than not hope or fearfulness, is the fact that we've come a long way with metastatic disease as well. So I'd like to have Jim comment on the use of neurosurgery for brain metastasis, which was unheard of in the day, for diagnosis, for tumor debulking, and for the prevention of a catastrophic event.
It's a good segue into that. We are clearly much better today than we were years ago in treating metastatic or secondary brain tumors. In the past, if I understand it right, the median survival or the midpoint survival of somebody with a metastatic lesion to the brain was less than 6 months when I first started doing this, and it really was a death sentence. Nowadays, that median survival is significant, and I can tell you as a surgeon, and certainly many of my colleagues, we all have patients who are living many years after their initial diagnosis and craniotomies for removal of the tumors. So I think we're a lot better at it. As I said, we are able to make smaller incisions. Surgical times are less. Anesthesia times are less. We can pinpoint lesions. We can take tumors out as small as 1 and 2 centimeters without injuring the brain in and around the area, and give them to people like you afterwards so that they can radiate the resection bed, because we know that there are cells in and around the area that we took out that could potentially cause a recurrence. I likened it to telling patients it's not like operating on the lung or the liver or other organs of the body where you could take big swaths of tissue around the tumor and get what they call a margin. We can't do that in the brain for obvious reasons because we're going to hurt people. So we have to stay within the confines of the tumor, what I call the brain-tumor interface, and be able to resect that tumor without taking out any of the brain tissue. But we're much better at it now, and absolutely, patients need to have hope for their treatment going into these procedures, because the patients are doing significantly better. And again, as you said earlier, it's because it's a team approach. I am not so of the belief pattern that this is all related to the neurosurgeon curing the disease. But I will say, with the combination of the surgeon, the radiation oncologist, and the medical oncologist, I don't want to use the word cure, but we get pretty darn close to taking care of these patients for a long time.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm equally as proud of the advances from my field, in the sense that, going back to that analogy, brain metastasis or whole brain radiation, and we would just kind of burn you, and 6 months and you're gone. It's certainly not that anymore. We now do what's called stereotactic radiosurgery. It's the only type of surgery I can do, is because no one will give me a knife other than a butter knife. So when we go in with our radiation beams, there are high doses of radiation to very small regions. So it's stereotactic radiosurgery, meaning that we are doing sort of an ablative technique with X-rays or with protons, as opposed to doing a surgical resection. The usefulness of stereotactic radiosurgery, as Jim mentioned, is both for tumors that can't be cut out, or for multiple tumors, or for even the tumor beds, as Jim mentioned. Not being able to get those margins means the chances of this tumor recurring without radiation would be very sizable. Lastly, I wanted to bring up 2 other techniques that we do in the situations where whole brain radiation therapy is necessary. Remember what I said, less is more. We want to do everything to save our patients and have our survivor thrivers live long, healthy, happy, cancer-free lives, but sometimes we have to do the whole brain, and we also want them to have good neurocognitive functioning. So sometimes we use some medications that they use for Alzheimer's, like memantine, and sometimes we do a special technique called hippocampal avoidance, which means we try to reduce the dose by dose painting and making, again, those fancy computers that we use to try to paint the dose, to reduce dose to those regions of the brain that are extremely, sensitive, especially for a long-term quality of life. And lastly, as Jim mentioned so nicely in his discussion prior, the medical oncologists, this is where I believe they are excelling. They're coming up with agents, or scientists, or doctor scientists, that are coming up with agents that cross the proverbial blood-brain barrier, and I'll let Jim explain that in a second. So in the old days, no medication, anti-cancer medication, could get through this specific interface between the vessels and the brain, which was a protective mechanism. So infections and things like that couldn't, seep into the brain and everyone die of brain abscesses. But at the same time, giving life-saving medications was not effective, thus the need for radiation. So I think in these cases, and I could speak of at least, a dozen patients come to my mind just in a conversation on a podcast of patients that have had brain cancer, multiple lesions, have, without even radiation or surgery, have some of these special targeted therapies. And basically they're living years and years and years completely fine without any evidence of disease. Jim, the blood-brain barrier, if you please.
Very simply, for the general public, blood vessels in the brain are a little different from the blood vessels throughout the rest of the body. Blood vessels in the brain, if you think of a garden hose with water going through the garden hose, nothing leaks out of the hose on the sides, but only at the end. So blood flow to the brain comes out at the end of the blood vessels and not leaking through the blood vessels themselves. If you think of the same garden hose, but now make it a soaker hose, for example, and the water now can leak out slowly through the garden hose before it comes out the other end. That would be an example of breaking down the blood-brain barrier. It's not important to go into the cells that make up the blood-brain barrier, but that's the difference. And the medications that the scientists, as you say, are developing are medications that open that blood-brain barrier so that you can let the chemotherapy go through the blood vessel and then leak out of the blood vessel into the brain tissue, and more specifically into the brain tumor. Otherwise, in years past, when we didn't have that ability, the chemotherapeutic agents didn't work very well in the brain because they couldn't penetrate that barrier.
Excellent. Jim, I really appreciate those comments. Angel, I have a question for you before you get into your assessment of the podcast and your take on it. Did Jim and I do our job? Did we demystify brain cancer and brain metastasis, and hopefully offer hope to our survivor thrivers?
Well, you're going to know that answer with my first part of the answer, because you just answered it. So really, it goes like this. I know that I didn't answer your question, but with that being said, I was going to lead off with the word. We've heard the word hope come up many times. So listening to the knowledge and what is available and what was not available years ago gives us hope. It gives us the opportunity to know that there are people out there, and technology has actually improved significantly enough that it is allowing us the opportunity to stay healthier, stay longer lasting lives, and not be considered a quote unquote death sentence. With that being said, I'd like to ask a question that did come up for the doctor, and that is, and you kind of touched based on it. You had stated earlier that you're very happy with the way that technology has gotten better, and that maybe not so much as in your lifetime, you're going to see things progress. My question was going to be, before you said that, was where do you see your medical field in the next 5 to 10 years? Does that give you hope?
You're asking me that?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. It gives me hope. We are a lot better today in the course of my career than we were earlier to be able to give patients hope and, as you say, not uh, leave them with a death sentence. It's important that they have good communication with their surgeons and their other medical doctors. But what do I see in the future? I see in the future what I see at the national meetings that I go to, where the vendors show us the new technology. And the technology that's out there is mimicking the same kind of technology that you see in the public world. Virtual reality, helmets on surgeons, where you can actually see the imaging studies within the helmet itself and be able to use your hands, not quite like the robotic surgery that they're doing today, because that really hasn't reached the stage where we can use it safely in neurosurgery. Neurosurgery still is dependent on the agility and the ability of the surgeon to work in tight places and small places using maybe a microscope. But as I said, the future is really going to be in the laboratory, because I think there are going to be newer medications and chemotherapeutic agents that are going to be able to attack the tumors as we learn more and more about their molecular genetics. And from the surgical standpoint, it's going to be more like, Star Wars and other films that the public is familiar with, where you can shoot smart bombs or do certain surgical procedures from a distance away. We're already able to do surgery remotely from one site to another with computers and things like this, like Zoom is able to use, for example. So we can be showing a surgeon, 3,000 miles away how to do the surgery if they're, say, in a combat zone or something like that.
And
Yeah.
just to give the audience a little bit peek behind the curtain as to who you are behind the we'll say the scalpel. Um, you had mentioned, or Dr. E actually had mentioned that at one point in time you had a decision and you were not sure if you were going to be an astronaut or you were going to be a surgeon. What was the one thing that made you realize this is the path you were going to go into? And to follow up with that, do you have any regrets?
I'll answer the second question first because that's easy. I don't have any regrets. I have been blessed with um, an ability that I was able to discover and then exploit it. And I don't do surgery now for my ego anymore. I do it because I genuinely enjoy the people who come back and say thank you. It's hard to find another gig like that. And I go to bed at night knowing that in some way I've made a difference in somebody else's life. So no, I don't regret 1 minute of the sacrifice that goes into it or went into it. And I would do it again if given the chance. How did I get into it? Well, the astronaut thing is really, every little boy has, or every little girl has a dream. And growing up in the 1960s, I was enamored with the Apollo moon program, which I remember vividly. But there was something about my fear of heights that just wasn't going to let that career kind of blossom. So when I was about 14 years old, I read two stories. People remember the Reader's Digest. There used to be a article in the Reader's Digest every month that was called I Am Joe's something. And Joe, of course, was an imaginary patient. They would do I Am Joe's heart, I Am Joe's liver. Well, one year in 1974, there was an article, I Am Joe's brain. And I read that. Had to read it for an English class, actually, in my 8th grade English class. And that kind of piqued my interest a little bit. And then I found a book in the library that was called The Making of a Surgeon. It was written by a general surgeon at NYU in Bellevue. I finished that book, and I was about the same age. I was about 14 years of age. And, I was a little different. I kind of liked my doctor when I would go to the doctor's office, as opposed to others who were afraid. So I decided at the age of 14 that I wanted to be a neurosurgeon. And I wrote it in my 8th grade yearbook that I wanted to be a neurosurgeon while everybody else was writing things like I want to be a baseball player and a football player. I knew that I probably couldn't do that, but I wrote I wanted to be a neurosurgeon, and I had tunnel vision after that.
And I guess I'll leave us with my final words. In life, we're given an opportunity. We are given our first breath. We are created to come into this world for a purpose. We are handed gifts, talents, and those gifts and talents that you possess, along with Dr. E, are patients like us reward and treasure. I want to commend you on doing such an amazing job explaining to the audience, and also coming onto the show to describe what it is that you do. I'm hoping that we have you back here to do a little bit more detailed discussion. What I'd like to see as the producer and also co-host is maybe more stories about what got you into this role, and maybe any setbacks or things that you've learned, maybe from a mistake, or maybe something that you feel made you a better surgeon moving forward. But for you, being on here today really makes us understand more what you guys do for a living. So for both of you, God bless you, and thank you so much.
Here, Angel. I couldn't agree more, Jim. It was a supreme pleasure to have you on the Croc podcast, and I believe that we did do our job. Our job today was to uplift our survivor thrivers. So you guys walk into a doctor's office and you leave being told you have a tumor in your brain. This brain tumor has been associated with certain death, with reduced with reduced likelihood of living. The concept of having your brain cracked open, to have it cut out, the thought of having a metastatic cancer in your brain, very scary stuff, very heavy. And yet here we are in a new age to tell you there is hope and not hopelessness. And that's what we're here about on the Croc podcast, is to try to give you guys hope, because at the end of the day, we all wake up in the morning and we complain about having to go to work, or whether it's too dark, or it's too cold, or it's too wet, or too hot, or too dry. And you guys have really something specific, to complain about, but you don't. You basically go in, you wake up, you are mom, you are dad, you are a worker, you are a student, you are a human being trying to get through your journey, despite the fact that you've just been told you have cancer. And that's why the Croc podcast is here. So to end this podcast, we want to first thank Dr. Melisi for being on with us, Angel Santana as our amazing co-host, and the entire board of directors here, who have just really pushed us to give you guys the best product we can, the Swiss Army knife of cancer survivorship. And we will end the podcast as we end every single Croc podcast, and that is with the blessing, the Croc blessing, wishing each and every one of you a long, healthy, happy, and cancer-free life. God be with you. God bless you. Peace.
Hey, Croc Nation. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the podcast to your friends. Visit our website, crocvip.com. We would love to hear your feedback.